The North Yuba Murmurs. Part 2. The Cold Case Files. The year 1978 closed, followed by 1979, then the entire decade of the 1980s. The story of the Yuba County Five, often shortened by the media to the Gateway Boys, faded from national headlines, settling into the chilling obscurity of an unsolved local tragedy. Sergeant Wells, though promoted and eventually retiring, never escaped the case. He carried the weight of the missing man, Gary Mathias, and the unanswered questions like a heavy, perpetual shadow. The official conclusion, for the 4 recovered bodies, stood as a stark and inadequate summary: death by hypothermia and starvation, complicated by paradoxical undressing and a brief, unidentifiable blunt force trauma to Jackie Hewitt. The case of Gary Mathias remained classified as a missing person, presumed dead, his large body swallowed forever by the vast, indifferent expanse of the Plumas National Forest. But unsolved cases, especially those with such baffling contradictions, never truly die. They lie dormant, waiting for a small, critical piece of evidence or a sudden burst of conscience to bring them roaring back to life. The journalist's obsession. In the mid-1990s, the case caught the attention of Ethan Stone, an investigative journalist with a keen interest in historical American mysteries. Stone was meticulous, driven by the sheer illogic of the 5 men's final hours. He was particularly obsessed with 2 points: the untouched food in the 2 cabins, Cecil and the Middle Fork trailer, and the mysterious, fleeting appearance of the dark pickup truck reported by Joseph Shantz. Stone began his own, unofficial investigation. He spent weeks poring over Wells's retired case files, talking to the families who, decades later, still lived with the acute pain of uncertainty. He found that the years had brought no peace, only an agonizing proliferation of theories, a secretive cult initiation gone wrong, a drug deal ambush, or even the work of a territorial, paranoid mountain hermit. His breakthrough came not from new forensic evidence, but from revisiting the original witnesses with a fresh perspective. The second interview with Shantz. Ethan Stone tracked down Joseph Shantz, the retired plumber, now living in a quiet nursing home. Shantz, older and frail, still vividly recalled the terror of that cold February night. Stone pressed him on the details of the dark pickup truck, the one Shantz claimed sped away down the mountain after the confrontation. "Mr. Shantz," Stone asked softly, "you said you heard a fight, a scream, and then a strange, calm voice telling them to keep going. Did you see anyone leave with the truck?" Shantz's eyes, clouded by age, momentarily cleared with a chilling memory. "Yes, I didn't see the driver's face, but I saw a passenger, a large man, standing by the Montego for a minute. He seemed to be arguing with someone, maybe the driver of the truck, and then he got into the passenger side of that truck." Stone felt a jolt of ice water down his spine. "A large man, sir? Could you describe him?" "Tall, broad shoulders, wearing a heavy, dark coat. He wasn't one of the boys. He was too imposing, too normal. He looked like he was in charge. He didn't look scared." This testimony shattered the assumption that the 5 friends were alone after the Montego was abandoned. Shantz had not only witnessed the confrontation, but a potential kidnapper or aggressor leaving the scene in the dark truck. More critically, Shantz's original police statement had emphasized that 5 men, the Gateway Boys, were in the Montego when they first drove past him. He had not reported seeing a 6th person. This meant the large man who drove off in the truck was a new figure, someone the 5 friends had encountered on the road. The question of the keys. Stone pieced together a terrifying new narrative. 1. The 5 friends, disoriented, stopped the Montego near Shantz's home. 2. They encounter the driver of the dark pickup truck. A confrontation erupts, the screams, the trauma to Jackie. 3. The aggressor, possibly having forced Jack out of the driver's seat, takes the Montego's key, not to drive the Montego, but to ensure the boys cannot return to safety. 4. The aggressor leaves with his truck, but not before delivering a final, psychological blow, possibly threatening them to keep going up the mountain. If the aggressor took the key, then the key found in Gary Mathias's boot, Chapter 10, was the final, terrifying trophy. A key taken from the aggressor or given to Gary as a chilling, final instruction. The most shocking realization: Gary Mathias wasn't the delusional leader of the fatal march. but the last and most successful victim of an unknown attacker, compelled by fear or post-traumatic suggestion to walk to his death. The key was not a symbol of Gary's command. It was the signature of the killer, left in the boot of the most confused victim as a final act of psychological cruelty. The cold case was now officially hot, driven by the realization that an unidentified man in a dark pickup truck had orchestrated the slow, frozen deaths of the Yuba County Five. Ethan Stone, the investigative journalist, now had a terrifying new hypothesis. The Gateway Boys were not victims of pure chance and cold, but of malevolent human action. The discovery of the key in Gary Mathias's boot, coupled with Joseph Schanz's late testimony about the large, imposing man in the dark pickup truck, forced Stone to look not for a natural disaster, but for a killer. Stone focused his resources entirely on identifying the mysterious truck driver. He analyzed the date, February 24, 1978, and the specific location, an isolated logging road in Plumas County. Such a vehicle, on such a night, had to belong to someone local, someone with a legitimate reason to be in that desolate area. His investigation led him to a retired timber foreman, George Harrison, who had worked in the Plumas National Forest for over 40 years. Harrison, initially reluctant, finally recalled a specific individual who fit the profile and possessed a similar vehicle, a massive, customized black Dodge pickup, notorious for its frequent use on unmaintained logging trails. The owner of the truck was a man named Roy Peterson. Peterson was a known local eccentric, a seasonal hunter, and, critically, a violent loner with a history of altercations and a deep, irrational hatred for anyone he perceived as intruding on his mountain territory. Roy Peterson had also been a primary suspect in a minor assault case in the early 1970s, but the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. Stone tracked Peterson to a remote property miles outside Oroville. He spent weeks observing him, gathering details, and building a profile of a man capable of the cold, calculated cruelty suggested by the evidence. The interview. Stone arranged a meeting with Peterson under the guise of writing a historical piece on Plumas County logging traditions. Peterson, a huge, taciturn man with eyes that seemed to constantly scan the tree line, was wary but eventually agreed to talk. After an hour of pointless discussion about timber yields and fire safety, Stone dropped the prearranged code word, February 24, 1978. A basketball game in Chico. Peterson's body language instantly changed. His hands, resting on the table, tensed into fists. The silence in the room became thick and dangerous. That was a bad night for the snow, Peterson growled, his voice low and gravelly. Stone pressed on, his own fear barely contained. The snow made it hard for a lot of people, including 5 young men in a Montego, and a plumber named Schanz. Peterson's eyes narrowed. I don't know any plumbers. But you know a turquoise Montego, Stone countered, pulling out a photo of Jack Madruga's car. You were there, near the Forbestown turnoff. You encountered them. Peterson remained silent for a long, agonizing minute. Then, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. They were on my road, he hissed. Intruding. They looked weak, confused. I told them to turn around. They were panicking, shouting. Stone took a deep breath. Did you take the keys, Roy? Did you take the keys and drive them off? Peterson's confession, or rather, his dark, fragmented account, finally spilled out. It was a story twisted by paranoia, malice, and a deep-seated contempt for anyone he viewed as an outsider. Peterson admitted to encountering the Montego. He claimed they were blocking the road. He got out of his truck and, in a fit of rage over their stupidity, began shouting. Jack Madruga, panicking, tried to reverse. The argument escalated. The fat one, Peterson said, referring to Jack Madruga, he came at me. I pushed him. Hard. I told them they were not welcome up here. I told them they had to keep going, up the road, away from the highway. Peterson admitted to seeing the large, dark shape of Gary Mathias, the one Schanz had described, standing silently nearby. And then, the critical admission. I reached into the car, yanked the key out, and threw it. Tossed it into the woods. So they couldn't come back down. They had to go up. Away from me. He then confirmed he got back into his black pickup and drove away, leaving the 5 men to the mountain, never looking back. Peterson denied any physical assault. He denied knowing anything about Jackie Hewitt's internal injury. He claimed he merely threw the key and shouted, asserting his dominance over his perceived territory. But Stone knew the truth was darker. The forceful push that dislocated Jack's shoulder, the terrifying trauma to Jackie's abdomen. These were likely the immediate consequences of Peterson's violent shouting. The psychological damage, however, was worse. He had removed the one tool of survival, the key, and left the vulnerable group with a final, terrifying command: keep going. Peterson's testimony, though incomplete and self-serving, provided the essential final link. The delirium that caused the boys to abandon the car and the cabin was reinforced, if not outright created, by the terrifying, authoritative command of a violent aggressor who stole their means of escape and literally forced them to walk to their deaths. The lost key in Gary's boot was now no longer a trophy, but a clue. The key Peterson threw, which one of the terrified men retrieved, clutching it not for hope, but perhaps as a final, useless security blanket. Roy Peterson's chilling, albeit sanitized, account of the roadside confrontation provided the external trigger for the Yuba Five's abandonment of the Montego. The key had been stolen, and the men were violently commanded to keep going, a directive that echoed Gary Mathias's own internal voices. But the path led them to the Cecil cabin, Chapter 4. The perfect, stocked refuge they inexplicably refused. Ethan Stone, armed with Peterson's testimony, returned to the cabin's file notes, determined to connect Peterson's malice to the group's fatal decisions. The hypothermic delusion amplified. The forensic report confirmed that the men ultimately succumbed to hypothermia, exacerbated by paradoxical undressing, the terrifying sensation of heat that causes freezing victims to strip naked. Stone theorized that Peterson's actions had not only initiated the march, but had dramatically accelerated the cognitive collapse that led to their final, fatal actions. 1. Extreme stress. The confrontation with Peterson, a large, angry man who assaulted two of them and stole their means of escape, plunged the intellectually vulnerable men into a state of extreme stress and panic. This shock would have already begun to erode their ability to make rational decisions, long before the cold set in. 2. Gary's delusion as reinforcement. Gary Mathias, already predisposed to auditory hallucinations, the calls, would have had his delusion violently validated by Peterson's command to keep going. The command from an external authority figure blended with his internal voices, making the need to ascend the mountain feel not just necessary, but sacred and urgent. When they stumbled upon the Cecil cabin, the men were likely already in the early stages of severe hypothermia, their core body temperatures dropping. Why they refused food. The greatest mystery was the untouched food. The cabin held enough cans to sustain them, yet they chose starvation. Stone proposed a grim answer rooted in their trauma, fear, and disorganization. The five men, especially Teddy Weiher, relied heavily on structure and routine. In a state of extreme stress and cognitive disorganization, the simplest task, like using a can opener, lighting a stove, or even recognizing food as a source of energy, can become an insurmountable obstacle. Their focus was not survival. It was compliance with the last, terrifying command echoing in their minds. Keep going. The sight of the food, the cans, the stove, these were all tasks, complications, and distractions from the singular, urgent goal of movement. They saw the cabin not as a refuge, but as an obstacle slowing their progress toward the peace Gary's voices promised. The stripped clothes and the final ascent. The discovery of the blood-stained parkas and boots inside the cabin was the final, devastating piece. Wells's initial theory was correct. They had to move, and they shed their protective layers inside the relative warmth of the cabin. But why the blood? Jackie's internal trauma was the result of the confrontation. But the blood on the boots and parkas suggested a different struggle, a battle against themselves. As the hypothermia deepened, the paradoxical undressing took hold. They felt the phantom burning, and rather than resting, they began to strip. Stone postulated that the blood was likely not from a second aggressor, but from self-inflicted trauma as the men, in their confused, frantic state, tore at their own clothing and skin, desperate to cool down. Or, perhaps more tragically, Gary Mathias, in his authoritarian delusion, forced the others to undress, believing the clothing was hindering their spiritual journey, a final, fatal act of misplaced leadership. Having stripped, they stepped back out into the night, even more susceptible to the cold. They had rejected safety, food, and clothing, sacrificing their lives to a trauma-induced delusion reinforced by a malicious local. The Cecil cabin, therefore, was not a missed opportunity. It was the exact location where 4 of the men lost their final grasp on reality, their survival instincts completely overwritten by the physiological effects of the cold and the psychological shock of Roy Peterson's attack. Gary Mathias, the one whose mind had first failed, was the one who led them out of the cabin, the keys to their escape buried deep in his own delusional path, leaving behind the stripped clothes as a final, macabre signature of their collective descent into madness. Ethan Stone did not sit on his findings. He presented his entire investigative file, including the detailed transcription of Joseph Schanz's updated testimony and the recording of Roy Peterson's reluctant, gravelly confession to the Butte County Sheriff's Department. He argued compellingly that the deaths of the 4 men were not merely misadventure, but a direct consequence of a violent, intentional act of criminal negligence and psychological battery. The Sheriff's Department, initially wary of reopening a decades-old case based on a journalist's speculation and a late witness account, could not ignore the synergy of the evidence. 1. The trauma. Jackie Hewitt's fatal internal bleeding and Jack Madruga's dislocated shoulder, both unexplained in 1978, were now perfectly accounted for by the roadside confrontation. 2. The keys. The missing Montego key, found in Gary's discarded boot, was explained as the stolen means of escape, not a forgotten item. 3. The delirium. The paradoxical undressing and refusal of food were now linked to a trauma-induced psychological shock, amplified by Gary's pre-existing condition and Peterson's chilling command to keep going. The Sheriff's Department formally announced the reopening of the Yuba County Five case. The investigation, now led by a new generation of detectives utilizing modern forensic psychology, was no longer focused on where, but who. The primary person of interest was officially Roy Peterson. Confronting Roy Peterson, the detectives, armed with the new witness testimony and the forensic overlay, brought Roy Peterson in for a formal interrogation. The environment was vastly different from Stone's casual interview. This was structured, recorded, and relentless. They pressed him specifically on the assault. Mr. Peterson, Detective Reynolds stated, placing photos of Jack Madruga's bruised shoulder and Jackie Hewitt's internal injuries on the table. You told Mr. Stone you merely pushed Jack. Forensic evidence shows Jack's shoulder was dislocated. That's a minimum of a third-degree felony assault. And Jackie Hewitt died with severe trauma to his abdomen. Peterson remained defiant, his paranoia hardening into concrete denial. I didn't touch the little one, he insisted, his voice shaking. I just wanted them off my land. I tossed the key. I yelled at them to go up the hill, and I left. The detectives realized Peterson would never fully confess to the assault. He was willing to admit to the theft of the key and the verbal threat because, in his mind, those were acts of rightful territorial defense. But admitting to causing the fatal injuries was crossing a line he could not breach without acknowledging himself as a murderer. However, the detectives didn't need a full confession to establish cause and effect. The sequence was clear. Peterson's assault and theft of the keys created an immediate, life-threatening situation. The psychological trauma, coupled with the loss of the car, propelled the vulnerable men into the freezing mountains. The subsequent deaths were a direct, foreseeable consequence of Peterson's criminal actions. The charge. The district attorney's office reviewed the evidence. Despite the decades that had passed and the fact that Peterson had not physically caused the death by a weapon, the legal argument was strong. They couldn't charge Peterson with first-degree murder, but they could charge him with involuntary manslaughter and kidnapping by force or fear, the latter referencing the theft of the keys and the verbal threat that compelled the men to walk. The charge was laid against Roy Peterson. The news rocked the small, quiet community of Oroville. After nearly 20 years of silence, the Gateway Boys finally had a suspect, an explanation, and the promise of justice. Yet, the primary mystery of the case, the man who held the final truth, remained unresolved. The prosecution needs to understand what happened after they left the cabin, Detective Reynolds told Wells. now consulting the retired sergeant. Why did Gary Mathias survive the longest? And what did he do with that key? Wells, standing by the map marked with the scattered bodies, pointed a shaky finger toward the final location of the Montego key near Grizzly Creek. Gary was the one with the voices, the strongest body, and the ability to retrieve that key, Wells said quietly. He didn't just walk. He was the one who was chosen by the killer, the one who was left with the burden of knowing. We have our suspect, but we still don't have our full story. The keys were found far from his friends. Gary saw something no one else did. The trial of Roy Peterson for involuntary manslaughter and kidnapping began in a tense, packed courtroom in Butte County. The families of the 4 recovered men sat in the front row, their decades of suppressed grief finally finding an outlet in the stark legal proceedings. The prosecution, led by a sharp, determined young district attorney, centered its case not on direct malice, but on the culmination of criminal actions that led to foreseeable death. The prosecution's case, the chain of cruelty. The prosecution's narrative was a meticulous, chilling reconstruction of the 4 men's final hours, weaving together the forensic evidence and the new witness accounts. 1. The roadside trauma. They called the lead pathologist, who testified about the dislocated shoulder of Jack Madruga and the severe abdominal trauma, to Jackie Hewitt. This proved a physical assault had occurred. 2. The theft of safety. Joseph Shans took the stand, his old voice trembling but clear, recounting the Montego driving past him, the shouts, the scream of pain, and the terrifying sight of the large, unidentified man, Peterson, driving away in his dark pickup, having stolen the means of rescue. 3. The psychological battery. The psychological experts testified about the extreme vulnerability of the 5 men, explaining how the shock of the assault and the loss of the key, combined with Peterson's command to keep going, would have instantly shattered their coping mechanisms, making them susceptible to lethal delirium. 4. The final key. The police investigator presented the Montego key, found in Gary Mathias's boot miles away, as the final piece of evidence of compulsion. Gary, the most delusional, was left with the trophy of the escape they could no longer achieve. The prosecution argued that Peterson, motivated by a paranoid territoriality, had knowingly disarmed and terrorized 5 vulnerable men, forcing them to choose between facing him or walking to their deaths in the mountain. The defense, natural causes. Peterson's defense attorney adopted a brutal but simple strategy. The boys died of natural causes. The defense argued, no direct link. My client did not kill these men. The cold, hypothermia, and their own inability to cope killed them. They chose to walk. They chose not to use the food in the cabins. This was a tragedy, not a crime. The key. They argued that the key was thrown into the snow and was likely found by one of the men, not purposefully taken as a weapon of compulsion. The trauma. The injuries were dismissed as resulting from falls or struggles in the snow, not an intentional assault by Peterson, who claimed he only pushed the driver. The defense focused heavily on Gary Mathias's history of auditory hallucinations. They painted a picture of Gary as the true, accidental culprit, that his internal voices were the real force that drove the men from the car and the cabin, making the deaths a tragedy rooted in mental illness, not criminal intent. A whisper from the past. The tension peaked during the cross-examination of Detective Wells, now retired Sergeant Wells. The defense pressed him hard on why they couldn't find Gary Mathias. Sergeant Wells, you never found Mr. Mathias. You never found the key until months later. Isn't it true that you don't actually know who took the key, or what transpired after the men left the Montego? Wells, standing stiffly on the witness stand, met the lawyer's gaze. We know a confrontation occurred. We know the key was taken. And we know that 4 men died because they were deprived of their safety. But there is one thing I have always kept in mind. The prosecutor leaned in. What is that, Sergeant? Wells pointed a finger toward the large map showing the scattered bodies. The bodies were found miles apart. 4 men died. Gary Mathias is still missing. Why did the assailant, if he was just defending his territory, not also steal Jack's wallet or the money? He paused, his voice ringing with authority. The key wasn't stolen for money. It was stolen to control the victim's trajectory. And I believe that Roy Peterson not only stole the key, but he also came back. He followed them. This last statement, though pure speculation, sent a tremor through the courtroom. The The defense immediately objected, but the damage was done. Wells had introduced the chilling possibility that Peterson's encounter was not a single, isolated fit of rage, but a deliberate, protracted act of cruelty, a hunter stalking his prey, ensuring the keep-going command was obeyed until the final, cold collapse. The jury was left with a powerful, unresolved question. Was Roy Peterson a neighborhood eccentric who simply pushed 5 men to their deaths, or was he a calculated predator who guaranteed their demise? The fate of the Yuba County Five now rested with the 12 individuals seated in the jury box. The courtroom was silent, suspended in a suffocating quiet that lasted for 3 full days while the jury deliberated. The small town of Oroville, which had lived with the Yuba County Five mystery for nearly 2 decades, held its collective breath. Sergeant Wells, retired but present, felt the familiar cold knot of the unsolved case tighten in his stomach. The absence of Gary Mathias, the missing key to the narrative, weighed heavily on the legal proceedings. Finally, on the 4th day, the jury announced it had reached a verdict. Roy Peterson, bulky and stoic, stood before the judge, his face an unreadable mask of mountain-bred indifference. The families of Jack, Bill, Teddy, and Jackie leaned forward, their hands clasped in silent desperation. The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged woman whose expression was one of profound weariness, handed the verdict slip to the bailiff. The clerk read the verdicts in a clear, measured voice. On the charge of kidnapping by force or fear, specifically regarding the theft of the motor vehicle key, we the jury find the defendant, Roy Peterson, not guilty. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Peterson's defense had successfully argued that the simple act of tossing a key into the woods, though reckless, did not constitute the crime of kidnapping or forced movement, especially given the men's profound state of mental disorganization. The jury believed Peterson's denial that he had compelled them to walk. The court waited for the second charge. On the charge of involuntary manslaughter, specifically regarding the deaths of Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jackie Hewitt, and Teddy Wyer, we the jury find the defendant, Roy Peterson, guilty. The air exploded with a mixture of suppressed sobs and muffled relief. Peterson swayed slightly, the veneer of indifference cracking to reveal a flicker of pure shock. The jury found that while Peterson did not intend to force them on the march, his reckless and violent assault upon the vulnerable men, the dislocated shoulder, the abdominal trauma, had initiated the chain of events. His actions constituted gross criminal negligence. By rendering them traumatized and without the means to drive, he created the direct, foreseeable risk that led to their deaths by exposure. The aftermath. Roy Peterson was sentenced to a substantial term in state prison, a judgment that finally delivered a measure of accountability to the families. The conviction established a legal truth. The Yuba County Five were not just lost, they were victims of a crime. Yet, the verdict felt incomplete. It offered closure on the how, negligence and trauma, but not the why, the pure malice of Peterson's actions, or the final, elusive piece of the puzzle, Gary Mathias. In the aftermath of the trial, Ethan Stone met with Wells outside the courthouse. "We got him, Sergeant," Stone said, his voice heavy. "Manslaughter. But he didn't confess to the assault, and we know he followed them, or at least he knew what they were doing." Wells nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant, silent mountains. "He took the key, Ethan, and Gary retrieved it. That key wasn't just a symbol of their helplessness, it was the token of their mission. Peterson initiated the madness, and Gary embraced it." Wells revealed that the investigators had found a small, peculiar detail in the Montego's internal report, a detail dismissed as irrelevant during the initial search. "We found a single, small, folded piece of paper tucked under the driver's seat. It was blank, except for one thing," Wells whispered. "What was it?" Stone asked, leaning closer. "A single, dark fingerprint. It didn't belong to any of the 5 boys. It was later matched to Roy Peterson. Peterson had not just approached the car, he had been inside it. He hadn't just pushed Jack, he had likely threatened them inside the confined space of the vehicle, leaving his dark signature on their sanctuary. The trial was over. The families had justice, but the North Yuba Mountains still held their greatest secret, the final destination of Gary Mathias and the true meaning of that key he carried until his last steps. The conviction of Roy Peterson brought a sense of grim satisfaction, But for Ethan Stone and the retired Sergeant Wells, the case could not truly be closed until Gary Mathias was found or his final moments understood. The discovery of Peterson's fingerprint inside the Montego, Chapter 16, solidified the new theory. Peterson hadn't just accidentally encountered them. He had entered their space, asserting his power and stealing the key as a means of controlling their terror-driven march. Wells's theory about Peterson following the men, like a hunter ensuring his prey moved in the desired direction, continued to haunt them. Peterson, the expert woodsman, knew the mountain. He knew exactly where they were headed and the lethal consequence of their lack of supplies. Weeks after the verdict, Wells received an unexpected call from a source he hadn't thought to consult in 2 decades, Silas Vance, an octogenarian trapper and recluse who lived in a small, remote cabin near the Feather River, far north of the Middle Fork region. Vance was known to distrust all authority, but the justice served to Peterson seemed to have loosened his tongue. Vance had followed the news closely, particularly the recovery of the bodies and the ultimate conviction. He claimed to have seen things on the mountain around the time of the disappearance, things he dismissed as hallucinations or animal movements, until the trial jogged his memory. Silas Vance's story. Ethan Stone and Wells made the grueling trek to Vance's isolated cabin. The trapper, grizzled and sharp-eyed, spoke slowly, carefully, his gaze often drifting toward the dense forest surrounding his porch. "I saw them lights," Vance rasped, gesturing toward the ridge where Gary's boot was found. "Not the car lights. Those came up the road, turned around, and went back down fast, like a fool in a hurry." This corroborated Shanz's account of the Montego and Peterson's truck. But later, Vance continued, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "On the ridge. Maybe a day or 2 after that heavy snow, I saw a torch moving slow up near Grizzly Creek." Grizzly Creek was the precise location where Gary Mathias's boot and the Montego key were finally discovered in June, Chapter 10. "A torch, Mr. Vance. Like a flashlight?" Wells asked. "No, not clean light. A big, oily light. Like an old kerosene lantern. And it wasn't steady. It was weaving, like someone couldn't hold it straight. And it was low," Vance emphasized, lowering his hand near the floor. "Lower than a man walking tall." The significance was immediate and chilling. Gary Mathias was a large man. If the light was weaving and low, it meant the person holding it was struggling, possibly crawling, or in severe distress. Vance then delivered the true blow. The light went out. But an hour later, I saw another light. A clean one, like a good searchlight. And it was higher, moving fast, heading right toward where the first light went dark. "Did you see who was holding the second light?" Stone demanded. Vance shook his head, looking troubled. "No, but it was a man moving with purpose. He was wearing heavy boots. A mountain man." The interpretation was instantly grim. 1. The first light, low and weaving, this was almost certainly Gary Mathias, staggering, dying, yet still following the voice and carrying the key. The light indicated he had found a source of fire or a tool, perhaps the kerosene lantern from the Cecil cabin or the Middle Fork trailer, which he used for his final, desperate march toward his destination. 2. The second light, clean and high, this was the hunter, the man who followed. Wells's theory was terrifyingly confirmed. Roy Peterson, the man who knew the mountain, had returned to ensure his compulsion. The order to keep going was carried out, or perhaps to retrieve the Montego key, the evidence of his crime. If Peterson was the second light, he would have reached Gary Mathias just as the weakened man collapsed near the creek. He would have found Gary, delirious, possibly already dead or dying. He went there to clean up, Wells concluded, his voice tight. He found Gary's body, or what was left of it, and he buried him. He retrieved the key, but then, in a moment of arrogance or panic, he put the key back in the discarded boot. A final, cruel gesture before covering the body. The mystery of Gary Mathias's disappearance was solved, not by finding his body, but by finding the witness to his final, desperate light and the hunter who stalked him. Roy Peterson hadn't just driven them to their death. He had followed them into the mountains to ensure the job was done, making the crime far more intentional and malicious than the involuntary manslaughter charge suggested. Despite the conviction and the discovery of Silas Vance's chilling testimony, which strongly suggested Peterson stalked and then buried Gary Mathias, the legal system had moved on. Peterson was serving his manslaughter sentence, and the case was once again dormant. However, Ethan Stone and Wells knew that the full, unvarnished truth was still locked behind Roy Peterson's paranoid silence. They decided on one last attempt to break through his defenses, arranging a final, recorded interview with Peterson in state prison months into his sentence. They hoped the isolation and the finality of his conviction might have eroded his need for denial. The man who met them in the sterile prison visiting room was smaller, weaker, and stripped of the mountain-bred arrogance that had defined him. The confinement had broken his connection to the wilderness he desperately claimed. "You got your closure," Peterson said flatly, avoiding eye contact with Wells. "I'm in here. They're dead. What more do you want?" "We want the truth about Gary Mathias," Wells stated, leaning forward. "We know you followed them. We know you were the second light at Grizzly Creek. Where is he, Roy?" Peterson remained silent for a long time, picking at a loose thread on his uniform. The weight of the mountain's secrets, which he had carried alone for 2 decades, seemed physically heavy on his shoulders. Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting Stone's, not with malice, but with a deep, unsettling emptiness. "I didn't mean for them to die," Peterson whispered, the first genuine sign of emotion Wells had ever witnessed. "I just wanted them gone. They were polluting my peace. They were weak." He then began to talk, not in a confession of murder, but in a rambling account of his dark, final night. The confession of cruelty. Peterson admitted that after driving away from the Montego, he felt a strange, compelling pull to return. He drove back to the abandoned car, noting the open doors and the absence of the keys. He knew he had inflicted a deadly fear. "I went up the road after them," he confirmed, validating Wells's theory. "Not to hurt them more, just to watch, to make sure they kept going away." He admitted he found them near the Cecil cabin. He saw the dim light filtering from the door, and he watched them enter. He waited, assuming they would use the stove and survive. But they came out, Peterson breathed, shaking his head slightly. They came out barefoot, without the jackets. They were making noises. Not human noises. The big one, Gary, he was leading, shouting at the others to follow him. He looked like a preacher. Peterson's revelation was chilling. He didn't force them out of the cabin. Gary's delusion, amplified by the shock of the assault, was a stronger force than survival. The paradoxical undressing was already in full effect, stripping the men of their defenses and their sanity. "I followed them for a little while after the cabin," Peterson continued. "The little one, Jackie, he collapsed first. The others just kept walking. They didn't even look back." He confirmed that he saw Jack and Bill stumble into the ditch, the location where they were found. He admitted he left them there, convinced that nature would do the rest. The final encounter with Gary. "And Gary," Wells pressed, "did you follow him all the way to Grizzly Creek?" Peterson hesitated. "He was the strongest. He walked for hours. He was singing or chanting. I found him the next morning. He was already down, lying under a cedar tree near the creek." Peterson confirmed finding Gary's boot and the Montego key, the one he had thrown. "I took the key. I was going to throw it in the river, but I put it back in his boot." Peterson's eyes were distant. It felt like it belonged to him. It was his ticket to that place he was heading. And then the most crucial detail. He wasn't dead, not completely. He was muttering. He looked peaceful. He kept whispering one word, over and over. "What word, Roy?" Stone asked, leaning in. Peterson looked directly at them, a final, cold truth spilling out. He was whispering lighthouse. He said, "I found the lighthouse. I'm home." Peterson admitted he didn't bury Gary. He simply covered him with branches and left. He couldn't bring himself to touch the man who died looking peaceful. The case was closed, not with a bang, but with a horrifying whisper. Gary Mathias, driven by his internal voice, the violence of an aggressor, and his final, fatal delirium, was not seeking Chico or a home. He was seeking a spiritual destination, the lighthouse, a place that only existed in his shattered mind. The Yuba County Five died because a violent man exploited the fragility of their minds, condemning them to follow a hallucination to a cold, remote end. Roy Peterson's chilling final testimony, that Gary Mathias had been whispering lighthouse and "I'm home" just before his death, provided the emotional core of the tragedy. Gary was not merely lost. He was found, having reached the destination his internal voices had demanded. But what did lighthouse mean in the heart of a dry, freezing mountain range, miles from any ocean? Ethan Stone, unsatisfied with the mere psychological explanation, became obsessed with the word. He spent weeks researching Gary Mathias's childhood and his time at the Gateway Center. He discovered that Gary, due to his sensory sensitivities, had often struggled with conventional religious teaching, finding loud churches and bright lights overwhelming. However, one staff member at the Gateway Center recalled a specific story Gary loved. Gary loved the movie Pete's Dragon, the retired social worker explained. He would watch the scene with the lighthouse over and over. He wasn't scared of the lighthouse beam. He said it was the only light that was strong but gentle. He called it a safe place where no one was angry. The word lighthouse was Gary's personal metaphor for safety, peace, and ultimate refuge, a destination free from the chaos and anger of the world. The search for the symbolic sanctuary. Stone shared this discovery with Wells. They realized that Peterson's crime was not just physical. It was a devastating psychological attack that hijacked Gary's deepest, most fragile spiritual coping mechanism. Peterson's command to keep going had forced Gary to abandon his routine and friends, compelling him toward the only remaining source of peace he knew, the symbolic lighthouse. Wells, utilizing his final authority before completely closing the files, initiated a small, private search operation near Grizzly Creek, the area where Peterson had left Gary's body. They weren't looking for a building. They were looking for a symbolic sanctuary. The search focused on a specific feature Wells remembered from the initial patrol maps: a natural rock cairn, an intentional pile of stones used as a marker, perched on a high ridge overlooking Grizzly Creek, about 100 yards from where Gary's boot was found. This cairn was often used by local rangers to signal the watershed boundary, and it was visible from miles around, especially at night. The team climbed to the cairn. It was tall, roughly constructed of dark, granite stones, and topped by a reflective metal plaque intended to catch the sun. As Wells and Stone reached the peak, the sun hit the plaque. It cast a powerful, straight beam of light that cut across the darkening valley below. "Look at it," Wells said, his voice hushed. "From here, at dusk, that reflection. It looks exactly like a beacon." They had found Gary's lighthouse. Gary, driven by his psychosis and the fear inflicted by Peterson, had walked until he could physically go no further, guided by the promise of that symbolic, peaceful light. He died at the foot of his imaginary sanctuary, the place where he believed the terror would finally end. The final dig. Wells ordered a discreet, focused dig around the base of the rock cairn. They searched the soft earth, the pine needles, and the deep undergrowth. They did not find Gary Mathias's body. However, beneath a thick layer of pine needles, the team discovered the undisturbed remains of a small, crude lean-to, a temporary shelter made of fallen branches and pine boughs, partially covered by soil. It was expertly hidden, the kind of shelter an experienced woodsman would make. Inside the lean-to, they found evidence that someone had used it: a fire ring, meticulously extinguished, and a thin, rusted piece of metal, a partially folded shovel head. The evidence was clear. Peterson hadn't just left Gary. He had returned to cover his tracks. He had buried Gary Mathias, not near the creek as he claimed, but somewhere deeper, harder to find, using the lean-to as his temporary base of operations. The cruelest irony was that Peterson, the mountain expert, knew exactly how to make a body disappear forever, completing the hunt he had started. Gary Mathias's body became the final, ultimate evidence of Peterson's true, calculated malice, a truth that would forever remain confined to the files and the dark soil of the Plumas National Forest. The discovery of the hidden lean-to and the final, symbolic meaning of Gary Mathias's lighthouse brought a tragic clarity to the Yuba County Five mystery. Roy Peterson had been tried and convicted for the deaths of 4 men, but the discovery that he had returned to the mountain, stalking Gary, and then secretly burying his body near the lighthouse, confirmed him not just as negligent, but as a malicious predator who took satisfaction in ensuring his command was obeyed until the end. Despite extensive efforts following the discovery of Peterson's hidden shelter, Gary Mathias's body was never located. The dense, granite-rich soil and Peterson's expertise in concealing tracks meant that the location of the final victim would forever remain the mountain's deepest secret. The aftermath and final closure. Roy Peterson served his sentence for involuntary manslaughter. He maintained his partial denial until the end, never confessing to the full extent of the physical assault on Jack and Jackie, nor admitting to the burial of Gary. He died in prison years later, taking the full, horrifying truth of his final hours with Gary Mathias to his grave. Sergeant David Wells, now fully retired, found a grim kind of peace. He had finally accounted for the Montego key, the untouched food, the stripped clothes, and the traumatic injuries. He had established a legal cause of death and identified the perpetrator. The case was closed, not because every question was answered, but because every possible avenue had been exhausted. Wells found closure in the knowledge that Gary died believing he had reached his peaceful destination, his internal struggles momentarily silenced by the cold. Ethan Stone, the journalist, published his findings in a lengthy, seminal article that became the definitive record of the tragedy. He framed the story as a profound warning, a reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the terrible consequences when that fragility is exploited by external malice. His work brought the families not a recovery, but a comprehensive understanding of why their loved ones made those impossible, fatal choices. The legacy of the lighthouse. The families of the Yuba County Five, Jack Madruga, Jackie Hewitt, Bill Sterling, Teddy Weiher, and Gary Mathias, found their final closure in a quiet, unofficial ceremony. They traveled back to the base of the ridge near Grizzly Creek. They placed 5 small, simple stone markers, one for each man, at the edge of the forest where the mountain began its ascent. They never referred to Gary's final resting spot as a burial site. They called it the Lighthouse Cairn. The true legacy of the Yuba County Five was not the mystery of their disappearance, but the tragic testament to their bond. For men, disoriented and terrified, yet loyal enough to follow their delusional friend, Gary, up the mountain, choosing companionship over the logic of survival. They walked together into a terrifying darkness, victims of a cold, indifferent man and a colder, unforgiving mountain. The North Yuba Mountains continued their silent vigil, keeping the final location of one gentle giant and the truth of a dark night's encounter locked away forever. The cold case was closed, leaving behind only the murmurs of the pines and the unsettling, eternal question: what did Gary see when he finally reached his lighthouse?